but in a way both of them are different writers. Today we are going to talk about Jane Austen as a novelist, but in order to evaluate her novels, we must contextualize her writings, the age in which she wrote her novels, and that was the time in which many major events took place. But as Rucha ma'am told us, there is not a single hint of those events in her novels. There are some stray references about those events. So, one of the most world shattering event was the French Revolution, and as you can see on the screen, that the French Revolution began when Jane Austen was just 13 years old, and as ma'am told us that she had written her first novel Love and Friendship before she turned 15. Now, French Revolution replaced old ideals, old world order, but it did not replace them with something new. There was nothing to fill the vacuum with, and therefore the French Revolution gradually turned into the reign of terror. As you can see on the screen, she lived a secluded and uneventful life. She lived in Hampshire and Kent and did not have any idea about the north of England. Now, I would like to mention here that she has written a letter to the librarian of the Prince of Regent, in which she says, I quote, she calls herself, I quote, the most unlearned and uninformed female who ever dared to be an authoress, unquote. And then she calls herself as somebody who wrote on 3 inches of ivory, who painted on 3 inches of ivory with a little brush. So she was immensely modest, and by now it has been proved that she was very well versed in French. She knew a little bit of Italian, and she was very well acquainted with Warren Hastings. She knew her contemporaries Wordsworth, Byron, and Walter Scott. And if you look at some of the novels of Jane Austen, then you will find that her heroines constantly talk about books. For example, Marianne discusses about some books that she had read with Willoughby, and she was rapturous when Willoughby also talks about those books in a learned manner. At the same time, in a novel Mansfield Park, when Fanny Price moves from Mansfield Park to Portsmouth, she had left her books behind in Mansfield Park, and for that reason she felt very bad about it. She constantly missed those books which she held to be very dear to her, and therefore she became a member of the circulating library. She used to take books from that circulating library, and she wanted to instill that habit of reading to her sister Susan, who was not very interested into this habit. At the same time, her another heroine, Catherine Morland, is also very fond of novels, and we have a reference of Dr. Samuel Johnson. Fanny Price quotes Dr. Samuel Johnson when she moves from Mansfield Park to Portsmouth, and the reference is actually about what Dr. Johnson differentiated between matrimony and celibacy. And Dr. Samuel Johnson had said that matrimony involved some pains, but at the same time, celibacy did not have any pleasure at all. So she, in a way, compared the experiences that she had living in Mansfield Park and at the same time in Portsmouth. So we can stretch our imagination into believing that Jane Austen was a well-read person, and she was just being modest by saying that she knew only her mother tongue and she had read very little into her mother tongue. Now, as you can see on your screen, Uh, the French Revolution had a vast impact across Europe, and there was another imminent threat to England from Napoleon. It was an age of Napoleonic wars, and Napoleon was leading his armies across Europe at that time. But there is not a single reference of the French Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars in her writings. And later on, we will talk about the exact reasons why she does not mention these major and tumultuous events in her novels. So, uh, there are various charges leveled against Jane Austen. One of them is that she was an escapist writer. Now, a layman or a student of literature who has just casually read the novels of Jane Austen will believe that Jane Austen is an escapist writer. But if we analyze her novels in a proper manner, if we put her writings in a perspective, then we find that she was not an escapist writer. She was the most realistic of them all. When the French Revolution began with the idealism, liberty, equality, and fraternity, all the writers who lived in the age of Jane Austen were immediately attracted to this movement. Among them were Coleridge, Walter Scott, and Wordsworth. And Wordsworth wrote a poem on French Revolution in which he said, "Bliss was it in dawn to be alive, but to be young was to be heaven." In that way, he praised the fervor, the enthusiasm which he felt at the prospects of having a new order in the society of England. But when England declared a war on France in 1773, Wordsworth was completely disillusioned. He was frustrated because the kind of impact that he had envisioned, it didn't materialize in England, because in France there was a large bloodshed, there was a violence on the larger scale, and anybody who was on the side of monarchy was immediately butchered. They were awarded death penalty, and even Jane Austen's brother-in-law was awarded a death penalty in France. So whatever ideals that they had about, whatever rosy picture that they had from the French Revolution were completely washed away, because the French Revolution gradually turned into the reign of terror, and the kind of impact that it had on the society of France, it did not have on the society of England. And for that purpose, Wordsworth went back into his own imaginative land. He created some utopian islands of his own in his poems. Walter Scott was also another disillusioned man, and he devised his own strategy. He wrote historical romances. He went to the medieval past to get away from the grim reality of the society, of the after effects of the French Revolution. But Jane Austen was a realist, and she did not go to any make believe world of her own. She faithfully presented what she felt, what she looked at the English society of that time. And for that reason, we cannot call Jane Austen as an escapist writer. She has not escaped into a utopian world, and from the very beginning, she is a very pragmatic writer. She does not nurse any ideas of social change overnight, and she does not believe that society can be changed in a shoddy manner. But she believes that it's a gradual process, and her concept of class system is also to be looked at. We will look at it later. Another charge that is leveled on Jane Austen is that she was not knowledgeable, and as I had pointed out, Jane Austen had read many books. Her two brothers were in the navy. Her relatives on the maternal side were directly or indirectly associated with the armed forces in England. So it would be wrong to say that she did not have any idea about the French Revolution taking place, and she did not believe in those. The only reason that I can give is she did not believe in something that could go against her idea of stability and her idea of social order. French Revolution aimed at completely overthrowing monarchy and establishing a new order. Now that was something which was in stark contrast to what Jane Austen stood for, and therefore she could not subscribe to this belief. Similarly, the another charge that is leveled against her is she had a very few social contacts, and she did not merge with people. She did not socialize much. Therefore, whatever social contacts that she had were not interested in the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. So her vision of the world was quite limited on that ground. This was another charge. But as I told you, she was quite familiar with what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. The only thing that the ramifications were not felt on this side of the Atlantic in England, and therefore she did not think it necessary to give vent to those suppressed anger which the French people experienced there. And sometimes she has been compared to Virginia Woolf. If you look at Mrs. Dalloway, written by Virginia Woolf, the novel was written just after the First World War, and there are some references to the devastating effects of the First World War, the rising rate of unemployment, the spate of suicides, nervous breakdown. But the central character, Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, in no way she is moved by these events. She is planning to throw a party when the novel opens, and she gives a party when the novel ends, and she doesn't have any ideology of her own about the war and the kind of aftermath that it has produced. She is just busy selecting the dress that she is going to wear, the kind of shopping that she would indulge in, and the kind of people who would throng her party. So Mrs. Dalloway is another character that can be compared with the characters of Jane Austen, and William Thackeray has also been charged with this complacency, that he did not write anything about Napoleonic Wars. But William Thackeray has given answer to that criticism by saying, I quote, "We do not claim rank among the military novelists. Our place is with the non-combatants." Unquote. Now, what William Thackeray has said about himself can be equally applied to Jane Austen. She enjoys this privileged isolation of her own. She enjoys this peace that a stable government offers in England, and that she does not like anything to ruffle the feathers which can upset her. And if she had wished, she could have written about French Revolution in her novels, because there are many characters in the novels who are directly associated with the armed forces. For example, we have in Pride and Prejudice a heroine called Lydia who flirts with soldiers. Then we have the sailor named William in Mansfield Park. Then there are Frederick Wentworth and Captain Benwick in the novel Persuasion. So, if she had wanted to delineate those events in her novel, she had ample opportunity to do so. But the fact is that she was just not interested in outlining the course of history, because she believed that war is an abnormal phenomenon, while uh, peace and daily routine are here to stay. And therefore she wrote about those things in her novel. There are some critics who believe that Jane Austen did not write about French Revolution because she was the first champion of art for art's sake, and art requires a selection. It has been said by someone that creativity is allowing yourself to make mistakes and exactly knowing which ones to keep. So in art, we make a selective choice of mistakes, and if it can be said a mistake, the exclusion of French Revolution, then she was very proud of it. So there is another writer called G.K. Chesterton, who described her as a writer content to write, I quote, a story as domestic as a diary, in the intervals of pies and puddings, without so much as looking out of the window to notice the French Revolution, unquote. And the as far as the ideals of French revolutions are concerned, liberty, equality, and fraternity, she held a completely different view of those ideals than what her contemporaries felt. She believed that equality is not a practical concept, it is just a utopia, while Wordsworth and Coleridge believed that